Oh, there we go. Molly, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you for having me back.
You know what? You were the seventh guest of this podcast.
That's
It's
pretty neat.
yeah, you were the seventh guest. The last episode. This will be episode 297. Isn't that funny? You were seventh. You were 7 and 297. Is this providential?
Well, yeah, I mean, seven is a pretty special number in the Hebrew Bible, right?
7 is a big. It's a big number. It's a good number on the roulette wheel. It's a nice number. Mickey Mantle was 7, right? And of course, there's a Seinfeld episode where George. That's the name he dreams of for his kid. He thinks it could be unisex. Seven Costanza, and then his cousin steals it, and he's freaking out and trying to convince her. And he's in the back of the car while she's in labor. Please don't take 7. Call her Soda. Call the child Soda instead of 7. So 7 is a fantastic number. 7, be it 7, be it 297. Yeah. So Molly, there's so much I want to talk to you about. You've just written this amazing book, Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History, from the Puritans to Donald Trump. Since I've last talked to you, you've had a religious conversion, and I found out recently that you love The Karate Kid. I love that movie. I saw it in the theater
Wow.
as a kid. I saw it. I was very young, but I did see it in the theater and have seen it probably a trillion times. I mean, it's and you are a fan of the song, "The Best Around," right? I am too. That it's the theme song, of course, in the tournament scene. I sent you something that is a fan theory that Danny is really the antagonist and the bad guy, and Johnny is a misunderstood, kind of a tortured soul, right? We'd say both sinner and saint. There's a Simos Eustace et Peccator. There's both a dark side and some redemptive moments for Johnny, and of course, this is this. So Daniel, I mean, is this a radically different way to look at the Karate Kid narrative? That Daniel is really an agitator and can't let conflict go, and really is the one that continues to sort of foster and fester a conflict that could be avoidable.
Well, I found the theory to be unpersuasive. However, the reason it has any purchase at all, and maybe where it is kind of stimulating, is it draws our attention to the complexity of Danny LaRusso and Johnny as characters. That neither one is a pure expression of the major element that comes to the fore. And of course, in the film, the real villain is Johnny's coach, right? Who tells him to sweep the leg. So I appreciated being reminded of the complexity of the two main antagonists, even if I wasn't persuaded.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Something as silly. Well, I don't know that it's a formative movie for my life, right? But in many ways, Karate Kid is a Rocky remake, right? In some sense, it's the underdog movie. There's the crowning champion at the end. The underdog. It's very interesting too. There's a book. I don't know if you know this book by I don't know if he's a former Jesuit or Jesuit, Jack Miles. It was called. He wrote God, a biography or something, and he wrote Jesus, Crisis in the Life of God. And he makes this observation, I think, in that book, that movies like Rocky only make sense in Christian culture. That this is a latent Christian story, that the marginalized one, the loser could be the winner, that the one to pay attention to could be the cast out one. That this is such a sort of a Christianized, sort of just running undercurrent culturally that I remember him talking about. I think it was some Japanese reception to missionaries. They're saying, if this person was so good, why did they die so badly? And just this, it's just interesting. You could say the Karate Kid is this deeply. There's a deeply Christian purchase on it, perhaps. I don't know.
That's interesting. I mean, of course, Danny wins through through the triumph of physical strength. So that doesn't seem particularly Christian. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking about famous stories like Ben-Hur and the rebellion of slaves, right? That do feature in the pre-Christian imagination. So maybe it's a little more complicated, but I certainly take the point that there's an inversion of values and an inversion of who we ought to be rooting for, which was so distasteful to someone like Nietzsche. That does show up in a kind of popular form in a movie like Karate Kid. That does have a particular valence that's only possible in Christian culture.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it's funny, this like silly fan theory, but it's interesting how familiar narrative can be seen in different ways, right? That you can that there's no uninterpreted life, right? There's no uninterpreted art, there's no uninterpreted stories, there's no uninterpreted figures, right? We're always making interpretive moves. You have made a major interpretive move in your life, right? You've gone from a studier of religion to not just a studier. I remember the Hair Club for Men commercials. I'm not just a member of Hair Club, president of Hair Club for Men. I'm a client, and the guy is actually, you find out, needed a hair replacement or something, right? You have been somebody that studied religion, that has been a historian, that has looked at religion. You've written about religion. You've written a great book on the great book I love, The Apostles of Reason. You've written a lot of other stuff about evangelicalism and Christianity, and then you went from being an observer to a practitioner. Has that changed your how you work as a historian? I mean, now there's that book by Tornaby or whatever, The Historian and the Believer. You're now the historian and the believer.
Yeah, I guess I'm a scientist who accidentally fell into my own experiment. I suppose it can't help but shift things. I mean, I have though reflected on this a lot, and in many ways, I think I simply own in a more philosophically coherent manner the presuppositions and guiding instincts that have always been present in my teaching and my research interests. But uh, when I was a secular agnostic, they had a very flimsy and incoherent foundation, really. But I think I've always tried to convey to students in my classroom the compatibility between the perspective of historians who are limited by the guild rules to certain kinds of evidence and can make observations on their subjects' claims about religious experience, but have to stay fairly agnostic about the reality, the supernatural reality and its presence or absence, and the perspective of believing members of these traditions and how their views, there's certainly tension, but they are more often complementary than explicitly at odds. I have noticed that becoming a Christian has removed some blinkers for me and widened the aperture of my intellectual interests. I shortly after becoming a Christian, my next kind of significant research project was an investigation of the question of whether you can scientifically demonstrate contemporary claims of miraculous healing, and whether this is possible, the dangers of it. And this took me down a road of a lot of reading and interviews with Christians both in this country and elsewhere, who've had experiences of supernatural healing, and got to know a couple of academics who have devoted quite a lot of their own professional energy and resources to this very question. And that was a whole world that I had simply not paid any attention to before I became a Christian, even though I thought of myself as someone who was open to nearly all claims, ways of viewing the universe. In practice, I had a very firm materialist, anti-supernaturalist bias that I think prevented me from engaging with the testimony of a lot of very credible people that really rocked my assumptions. And that's a set of questions. That's a line of inquiry that I don't think I would have pursued before becoming a Christian.
I love that phrase, wider aperture, because I'm a Christian, and I this podcast isn't explicitly religious. I mean, I would guess if you looked at the vast majority of the guests are not religious or not writing on religious themes. You know, novelists, pundits, all kind of memoir, all kind of people come on here. But I'm not. I am who I am, and it's part. But that widening of the aperture is great because I've said this at least a couple times this year, explaining to people what Christianity did and continues to do for me, and it's just for me, it's been the most comprehensive way of seeing the world, right? It accounts for more than it leaves out, right? It makes sense. But you know what? But I've also said, and there's, look, I say all systems, all worldviews, all beliefs, and things like this are. I remember when I was a kid, and you get you're learning division, right? And then your chapters, your books, whatever, and then you get to that chapter with remainders, and you're like, oh my gosh, it's not just 8 into 64; it's 9 into 346 or something. And there's remainders. I always think I always thought that's a good analogy for what happens with any comprehensive way of being and seeing the world, right? There's going to be remainders. There's going to be there's going to be things that just don't work well in the system, or that remain in brackets, or just we don't know how to deal with this. I'm wondering, as somebody that's been a Christian for a couple of years, what are the remainders in the division problem? Are there things that are sitting that are just like, gosh, wow, it would be great if I could come up with a way to fit this in more organically or into the story, if this was more integrated.
Hmm. Well, listen, I am certainly a Christian, but that doesn't mean I don't still have to talk myself into the whole thing every morning. I mean, it's it's bananas, and it's totally, it's a lane that is still, such a distance from the lane in which I operated for, my whole childhood and adult life up until 3 years ago, that I still very much have to make that conscious move. And my conversion process, which your listeners can Google up or go to my website and find a few of the interviews I've done where I talk about it at length. It was an incredibly nerdy, cerebral process where I engaged a lot with traditional apologetics and focused on the historical evidence for and against the resurrection, and also exploring cosmology, arguments for theism. I had to get myself there too. So I have still a kind of unhealthy addiction to apologetics, and that I have to manage, because I have a keen desire for pursuing all the questions to some solution, and it's very difficult for me to accept that becoming a Christian involves it absolutely involves application of your reason, right? This idea that faith and reason are opposed is totally ridiculous. Um, but it is about the recognition of the limits of reason, and that at a certain point you have to kind of take a step beyond that. And I very much struggle with that. A particular point of anxiety, I suppose, that I kind of think about on a regular basis, is that to open one's mind up to the action of the supernatural, to accept that this is not a closed universe, and that there are real limits to the data we can have about the universe based on Western science. It opens a big can of worms. It's not just the Christian can of worms that it opens. So I'm really interested in accounts from UFO experiencers, for example. I think if you're going to take people's claims about miraculous healing after they prayed to Saint Joseph or whatever seriously, you have to take
Yeah.
all the crazy stuff that people say. And that's something I'm working out, and I appreciate that. Some very smart, thoughtful Christians like Ross Douthat and Rod Dreher have recently written books where they are openly wrestling with these same questions, and acknowledging the huge range of weird stuff that people say happens, that I think it's a mistake to tune out. So what's the right balance between being an intellectually honest, consistent, open-minded person, who's not shutting out all data that interferes with your presuppositions, while still being convicted of where you stand? That it's a hard thing. to do both of those. And I appreciate being in a church, having mature Christians in my life who have always made me feel that I can bring all my doubts and all my questions. And I tell my pastor, hey, I'm reading this book about UFOs and I have some questions. And, he might roll his eyes a little bit, but he takes me seriously, and he doesn't, tell me I'm a heretic and I can't lead Bible study anymore. So I think it's crucial to be in a community where no questions are off limits, and
I don't.
you can do your thinking out loud.
I had a professor in seminary once. He said, he was a historian. He said, "Look, if somebody told me they dug up the bones of Jesus, right, and these people said, these archaeologists said these are the bones of Jesus, it wouldn't do anything because I just wouldn't believe it. I would say, no, it's not going to hurt my faith. It's just, come on, you can't." He said, if aliens came down and landed and they had the Quran in Arabic, that would be tough.
I appreciate his willingness to go there.
Yeah,
Yeah, to
I
have
know
that
these
thought
are
experiment.
these are interesting questions, right? I mean, they're but they're interesting. I mean, the tradition. Somebody like C.S. Lewis who thinks about his space trilogy stuff, and Brian McLaren, apparently the guy who was a founding father in the emergent church movement. Apparently, a mutual friend of ours just told me he's coming out with a sci-fi trilogy. So these things are interesting parts of, I think, the Christian imagination, right? What's out there and how you bring it into the economy imaginatively of what we know, right? Of what's been revealed in these things, and what are the remainders, right? Maybe these were,
Yeah. Lewis's space trilogy was really important for me, and I think his willingness to be committed to Orthodox Christianity while also acknowledging that there's a God has revealed to us what we need to you know be in right relationship with him, and no more, really, right? So who are we to say that he doesn't have other plans for other parts of the universe? And Lewis's willingness to play with that and construct, I mean, I find the world that he creates in the space trilogy to be really provocative and persuasive, and it broke through, I think, the sense that Christianity is a parochial faith. That has to be totally limited to our blue marble, when we know that there's so much more out there. That's one of the valuable things about the space trilogy.
Yeah, I find when I talk to friends who are second, and I live in Philadelphia. I live in Philadelphia. This is blue as blue gets, and pretty non-religious. At least the sort of, if you look in among working class non-whites, it's not irreligious. But if the sort of professional class and stuff, it's there's a lot of hostility to religion and stuff. And I often say, like, what you're critiquing is a very caricaturized view of something like American evangelicalism, and a caricaturized view, because I wouldn't, I could take you to Wheaton College or something. If I could take you to talk to people I've had on the show, but it's just, and even that is a sliver, right? I mean, this is a big sandbox, and complex, and with lots of tensions and and that's what's always interesting to me about it, right? Is you find these people that it's just such an interesting, complex tradition, right? And it oftentimes the critics are fixated. No, again, that tradition has problems, right? I mean, that all of us in it have to say, yeah, we haven't figured this one out yet, but I think it's more expansive. Something I wanted to ask you, and we'll get into your book, I promise. But I think I so your book has a great typology. I have a typology that I was talking with somebody about yesterday. So I think that adults that have faith, I generally put in one of three categories, right? If they're an adult and they have vibrant faith in the United States, or North. I'm thinking in my own context, but I'm sure this is true other places. But I think you get there one of three ways. You get there through evolution, revolution, or conversion, right? That there are some adult Christians I know, and Jews or other people in Christians, that they've got there from evolution. So they grew up in Episcopalian or Baptist or something. No, their adult faith isn't directly the inheritance of what they received, but they've taken things apart and cast things away and picked up new tools and things like that. but it's not traumatic, right? I mean, it's not been, it's something that there's more continuity than discontinuity from on the journey from the faith of their childhood, what was received, to what is now believed. Then I think there's revolution people, right? A lot of my friends were founders in the emerging church movement, and these were people like a hard no. If we're going to continue in faith, we've got to have a revolution. And you talk about people like this in your book a little bit. Early on, some of the prophets are people that are somewhat revolutionary at times, although sometimes more seem more so on the surface and then aren't. And but the revolutionary folks are the no. I got to say no before I keep saying yes, and I've got to change this. And then there's folks like you who are converts who really come from outside the tradition. It's not an evolution, and it's not a no first to what's going behind and sort of reworking. And it's really coming from outside and being adopted or adopting. Stanley Hauerwas says, we think about great traditions as you feel like you didn't choose them, but they chose you. How do you get along with, how do you find yourself interacting with people that are, because you're a convert, with other people in my typology, with the evolvers and the and the revolutionaries? Like, how do those relationships work? Like, how do you, I mean, are they, do you interact with folks in those camps, and what's it like?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think it highlights my experiences have highlighted for me the way in which all three of those lanes come with certain gifts and certain burdens. I've had many conversations with people who have spent their whole lives inside generally kind of conservative evangelical circles, and they're in some they're somewhere on the kind of journey of deconstruction and rebuilding or leaving. And we'll have a conversation where inevitably it comes out that crucial to their disillusionment and alienation from Christianity is a personal story of trauma and disappointment. Whether it's kind of dysfunction in their family, or a person in church leadership who disappointed or betrayed them, mistreated them in some way, or it's a kind of personal relationships that have suffered under the weight of other humans and what they do in their depravity. And my internal response to these stories, as someone who didn't grow up in it and had a very kind of in some ways insulated process that allowed me to really just focus on the the question of whether the claims of scripture are true, and is Jesus who he says he is. Like my intellectual response is to say, I'm sorry that your pastor at your family's church was a giant jerk, but what does that have to do with the question of whether or not the tomb was empty? Like, logically, they're not related at all. And in fact, Christianity has in its anthropology the best answer, the best account for your experience with the crumminess of human beings. However, I understand that this is not how humans work, right? We're not brains on sticks. We're not logical calculating robots, and so we would be paralyzed. We wouldn't be able to move through the world if we didn't continually take shortcuts in the conclusions we draw about what is true, based on trusting certain authorities in our lives, kind of outsourcing our the hard work of proving from first principles, your picture of reality, based on what your parents believe, what the church you grew up in believe, your favorite professor, this kind of thing. This is the only way to function in a complicated society. And the problem then is that when that very human authority figure lets you down, turns out to be a hypocrite, you don't have anything underneath that to support your faith and the claims that you adopted in the first place because you trusted that source of human authority, and so naturally they crumble. This is not to say that my own process is a completely, like I just constructed a computer program and ran scripture through it or something. Of course, emotion and desire and other non-rational factors factored into my own process too. But what I conclude there is that on the one hand, it's been a gift to be able to come to the church with all its messiness and complexity and skeletons in the closet, and but as a kind of a fairly fully formed, mature thinker, um, able to view those problems in a clear-eyed way, but in a way that doesn't so quickly taint my ability to develop, evaluations of scripture and think through, Jesus's claims about himself. On the other hand, it does mean that, there are many parts of ordinary Christian life that I'm just way behind on. I mean, I think of it as like a kind of spiritual autism. I'm very, I'm sort of a savant on like some of the nerdy pieces of it. I know an awful lot of church history. I'm a pretty sophisticated grasp of theology, but the whole experiential side, which one is constantly confronted by if you hang out with evangelicals. They're always going on about their relationship with Jesus and God really showed up, right? Like all of these ways that evangelicals talk. And I mean, I'm not shy about interrogating them. What do you mean when you say that God showed up, or that was a God thing? Like, what does this mean,
So
right?
I heard somebody say a God print. That was a total God print. Like, so
Okay,
that would be like
yeah,
I guess like a footprint of the divine, like a God print.
okay, yes, yes. But I think I think not having grown up with prayer, with worship, other than my kind of amateur anthropological forays into attending worship in college and beyond. These are things that come very naturally to so many of my Christian friends. Also, when I kind of grill mature Christians, which I do fairly often, on their warrant for faith, like why do you have confidence that any of this is true? Almost always, they tell a story that amounts to I see all of these points in my life when God intervened, when there's just clear evidence of his providential care for me. And what I see there is that having faith as a Christian, it involves developing habits of mind, like being occupying any kind of social location or identity. You have to be socialized into the habits of mind of your group, and Christians learn how to narrate their own past through this lens of God's providence. And also, I see in this that uh, being a Christian of confident conviction requires just kind of clocking a lot of hours. As a Christian, you have to be patient, because it's only through the passage of time and your own passage through travails and learning to rely on God that then you get to the other side and you can look back and see God's hand in it. And you don't get that overnight. You're not handed that as a convert. I mean, maybe if I had like a mystical vision of Jesus at the foot of my bed, I would hang on to that, but I had nothing of the sort. So that's it's been hard for me to accept that much of what I pray for as a new Christian, that kind of confidence I would love to have, it's just requires patience. It doesn't. It's not going to happen on my time frame.
Yeah. So two things that as you're talking, two things. First, I think I'm wondering. Well, first, it's when you talk about these people that talk about God showing up, and I have so many people in Philadelphia where I meet. If I go to a party or something, say they're spiritual, not religious, and I wind up saying, I think I'm the opposite. I think I'm religious, but not particularly spiritual. I don't have these like transcendent mystical experiences, but I mean, this story is really important to me, and these traditions, and I live in them, and they're meaningful. But I don't know that I'm all that. My own experience with Christianity is pretty earthy. It's pretty here. It's pretty on the ground. But I'm also wondering, because what you're saying is part of the training in Christianity, right? Great Kierkegaardian phrase is learning to re-narrate yourself, learning to tell a story. Has your training as a historian helped you there? That because you've studied how people tell story. What is history? But rendering the past doesn't story itself, right? You've got to make a story out of it to make it accessible to anybody, right? Otherwise, you just have facts, naked facts, which they don't do anything, right? I mean, has your work as a historian helped you in that part of the Christian journey of having to learn how to tell a story differently with God maybe as the main actor?
That's really interesting. Certainly, my training as a historian helped me to navigate my investigation of the controversies over historical evidence as it pertains to the claims of Christians about the career and resurrection of Jesus. But that's a separate question from um, learning to re-narrate my own story. I think I still really struggle with that. One question I often get is how can you join this group that has committed all kinds of atrocities across human history, and I I ended up getting evangelized in the context of a Southern Baptist megachurch, and the Southern Baptist Convention has become shorthand for a lot of people, for especially in the secular left circles in which I am frequently, for many sins, and certainly they're not wrong, but I think because I have been a historian my whole adult life. I mean, the more you study human history, the more you are confronted with just an endless record of depravity, regardless of people's ideological or religious affiliations. I mean, we're all terrible. We're all sort of hanging on to civilization by a fingernail.
Well,
So
Chesterton writes this in the London Times, right? There's this essay contest and the essay contest was "What's wrong with the world?" was the prompt, and Chesterton just wrote in a 2-word answer: "I am." Signed, G.K. Chesterton.
exactly. So I guess I'm not impressed. Like there's just no group. There's no group one can join, where you would be on the side of the angels. And I think there's a certain asymmetry, because to me the story of secularization is the story of the declining trust and sense of obligation that Western individuals have toward institutions of all kinds, not just religious institutions. And I think that whenever you have a kind of institutional concentration of power, you have more potential for abuse, more
Right,
temptation,
right, right.
and so there's sort of no institutional equivalent to the kinds of religious institutions that have do sometimes end up in scandal, on the traditional Christian side of the spectrum. So I think that there's a way in which secular liberal people, because they live in an even more atomized, hyper individualistic mode than people who are in traditional religious organizations. They can kind of distance themselves from the way you end up more face to face and sometimes implicated in real depravity if you are part of an active community and organization. So that to me is one kind of feature of our landscape that figures in this story. But I am a complete spiritual infant when it comes to a lot of things, and certainly I would include this whole necessary endeavor of learning to understand my own story. I have two kind of modes in my brain that operate at the same time. I mean, I have the mode that is learning how to see things that have happened in my life uh, as showing God's intention and agency, and then I have the other secular professor voice that says, "Oh, isn't that interesting? The way Molly is learning to reinterpret coincidences." And I have to continually remind myself that it's not that I moved from a neutral position to
Right,
a
right,
non-neutral Christian position. It's that before I was socialized
right.
into seeing things as coincidences, and now I am being socialized into a different kind of epistemological mode.
Yeah, it's interesting because you say, and I like the metaphor of infancy because I think there's a different. I mean, Jesus commends childlike faith, not childish faith, right? There's a difference, right? That when we say childish, that's very different than childlike, right? Because the best of childlike is this openness, wonder, constant growth, like a resilience too. I mean, there's so much about childlikeness, right? That's it's a beautiful thing. You say in the book, you say religious charisma and secular political charisma may not be the same thing, but they are one united story, one in which all the characters, whether devoutly religious or proudly skeptical, are searching for a role in a plot grander than the one they are living. This is so great. This is not just a matter of finding an institution to serve or tribal boundaries to defend. The human need here goes deeper. It is a metaphysical craving, a sense that the universe must be more principled than the average day of the average person, which suggests this goes down to sentences I wish I would have written. This is so great, right? It's just not enough to get up. It's not even enough to have a tribe. It's not even enough to have safety, right? This whole thing has to mean something, right? That the whole thing has to get together in some sort of coherent narrative that says, I understand who the good guys are, the bad guys, what the problem is, how to overcome it, where I am in the arc. And you say that this is what charisma does, right? It kind of the charismatic person, and it's a shared thing, right? Because it's not just it's not celebrity. You say it's not charm, but this is what the role of charisma is in some to some degree, right? To find the story, to unveil the story, to tell the story, and it's a give and take, right? With not it's not all just the leader, right? It's a give and take between the follower and the charismatic leader, right?
That's right. When I started the project, I mean, I think I myself was kind of confused about what charisma is. That was part of what was intriguing about the project. I think it's a term we use in our everyday conversations about politics or religious leaders, and its usefulness has something to do with how vague it is, because we can sort of toss it out when really we don't quite know how to account for a particular leader's appeal to his or her followers. And I was interested in intertwining the story of charisma in that sense of authority, that often functions in political contexts, that is distinct from the authority that comes with an institutional role or military might. So, this is the sense that we've inherited from the sociologist Max Weber, with charisma in that New Testament sense, that has different meanings in different parts of the New Testament. In Romans, Paul uses the word to describe, God's free salvific grace to all Christians. In 1 Corinthians, he is speaking more about specific spiritual gifts, tongues, prophecy, healing, this kind of thing. But to me, they are interwoven, and that the heart of both of them, in a sense, is an invitation to enter a story that's bigger than ourselves. I thought when I began this project that I would be profiling leaders who were all immensely charming, really good at working a room, good looking, fantastic orators. That was true here and there, but it was truer in the breach than in the dominant pattern. And in fact, most of the leaders I found myself writing about were very polarizing. So maybe some people would find them very personally compelling, but just as many or more found them totally repellent. And that, plus the fact that their power to build movements, it seemed to move far beyond kind of interpersonal contact with the leader, and could travel through all sorts of different media. This helped me, find my way to this argument that the core of charisma is a particular kind of storytelling, and pulling back the veil on a new view of reality that, for the followers, makes more sense of the world than the other stories on offer in the culture. And it is a transcendent story in that it needs to connect, their puny mortal lives to some source of ultimate concern, and provide a sense of both kind of empowerment, while also the security of knowing that, well, forces, powers larger than me are controlling the big shape of this plot, and I don't have to worry about the feeling of chaos. I mean, as humans, we hate chaos. And I do think this is at core a religious impulse. And just because in our secular age, it's an impulse that is not landing as often as it used to in traditional houses of worship, I think it's a mistake to think that it's vanished. So, part of what motivates the project is the hypothesis that perhaps one place this religious impulse is landing is in the relationship between certain leaders and their followers.
Yeah, I mean the narrative. I think about. I mean, the end of the book you talk about Donald Trump, and I think about Kamala Harris and it seemed like, I mean, Trump had a story, right? Okay, we're gonna make it great again. The Epstein files, the immigrants. Okay, so fat prices, eggs will be free. Okay, we love that. And I felt like it was it was so, and I felt like, and look, I mean, I voted for Kamala Harris, but I mean, I felt like the Kamala Harris story was, look, you're just gonna do better. He's too scary. The economy will be better, and we'll have trans bathrooms. And look, even Liz Cheney says I'm not that bad. I mean, it was just, I mean, running around my state of Pennsylvania with Liz Cheney, I thought, in an age of disruption, right? It, in an age where people are fed up with, they're skeptical about the economy, about international alliances, about democracy, about all of these things, you're running around with Liz Cheney saying, hey, look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, that I feel like the story stuff you're talking about in the book, where you talk about the unveil the story. This is why Trump won the election, right? I
I
mean,
think so. Yeah, I think Harris had a number of very intriguing policy proposals, but that's just not enough. The other piece of this too is that we are in an age where institutional credibility is at an absolute nadir, and I mean institutions just across the board, from Americans' views of Congress, universities, the mainstream media, you name it. Americans' trust in all of these, and it's been declining for a couple of generations, but it's especially low now. And here the Democrats nominate the institutional candidate, who's very much a face of all of these, big impersonal forces that Americans are more cynical about than ever. And so, it's no wonder that they didn't vote for her, despite fairly reasonable proposals for how to solve concrete problems.
yeah, and like I said, you say in the book that it's not charm and it's not celebrity. Kamala Harris certainly was charming, or could be at times. I thought, and she was instantly celebrity. I mean, everybody, all the celebrity. I mean, she just, she had the embrace of celebrity. She had celebrity quality. That's not charismatic, right? I mean, Bill Clinton, I think people in your score of charisma, I think people mislabel Clinton as more charismatic than really he's exceedingly charming, right? And everybody says, even if you hate Bill Clinton, if you're in the room with him, you feel important, you feel connected, but that's not charisma, right? So you could be, you talk about holy fools, you talk about these people like Whitfield, or cross-eyed and kind of strange and dramatic, and you talk about a host of figures, particularly in the prophet section, right? One of your first type there. A lot of these people are just unseemly, kind of agitating, annoying that they're not charming, right? And yet they're able to unveil a story. Is that part of the key that you need to understand the book, that get charm and celebrity out of the off the radar?
Or at least don't make them the center of it. I mean, certainly in the case of someone like Bill Clinton, I think you're very likely not going to be in that room or at the rally unless something has happened upstream that has compelled you to buy into the story he's telling. And I want to be clear, when I talk about storytelling, I think that can sound like I'm suggesting that the key to charisma is lying, is
Right,
is
right.
fabricating a vision of reality. Some charismatic leaders do that, and I think this is the difference between charismatic leaders who are ultimately a force for moral progress in history and those who are not. But I think about someone like the Quaker, the deeply anti-charming Quaker prophet Benjamin Lay, who was really ahead of his time, agitating in all kinds of outrageous ways. Standing out in the snow, in his bare feet, dressing up in a military outfit and running a sword through a Bible in which he had concealed a bladder of berry juice in the middle of Quaker meeting, to convey to his fellow Quakers, who at this time were mostly slave owners, that they had blood on their hands. All these things were revolting to most people. But he was telling a new story that was focusing on and arranging facts in a new way that was then revelatory and absolutely conveying the reality of the suffering of enslaved people. And I would say Martin Luther King's charisma is also in this category, but it's not enough to just point people in the direction of new data, new information, and offer a corresponding policy platform. I think in our own time, the Democrats did, and still to some extent do, run on a kind of cobbled together narrative that casts Americans in roles based on a very shallow understanding of their identity category. And part of what we saw in the 2024 election and the swing of so many of those categories of non-white voters, more toward Donald Trump, is, I think, a resounding rejection of that way of casting Americans, that
In the
attempt at
terms of
storytelling.
your book, right? They're trying to work the expert charisma card, play the expert charisma card when it's the guru charisma card, right? I mean, people expertise ain't what it used to be, right?
Yes, and I mean, really, stepping back from the narrative I learned through working on this book, I think American faith in and respect for experts is really the exception in our history. It's not the rule. And there was this period directly after World War II that lasted for roughly 2 decades, in which American respect for the story told by technocrats, the brain trust of John F. Kennedy, the expert class in the mainstream media, was at a kind of apogee, partly as a reaction to the trauma of World War II and the sense that Adolf Hitler represents what charismatic leadership can do. And demagoguery has no place. It's incompatible with modern Western democracy. And so this is a time when, a lot of social scientists in America and more broadly in the West are rejecting charisma as a category worth applying to their own cultures, and they're instead seeing it in newly independent states in Africa as a kind of a pre-modern manifestation of power that is kind of a carryover from tribal religion, but it's something that every society ought to outgrow. And I think it's a time of blindness to the persistence of those same impulses in their own culture. But it also, it's a period of relative respect for experts with plenty of asterisks, right? Because, I mean, this is also the time of McCarthyism and so forth. It's not like all things are all peaches and cream. However, it's a time when, the university class has a kind of cultural authority that really erodes. They, I think partly sabotaged themselves in the course of the 1970s and 80s. And you're right. I think now we are in a place now where, I mean, probably because of the period of success that Obama had, and the way Obama, I mean, I think he had multiple charismatic modes, and this in the book is one mark that I trace that shows up in effective charismatic leaders who end up being able to gain institutional authority and make some kind of imprint. I would say the same is true of George Washington, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Martin Luther King. They don't purely adhere to the charismatic type that is kind of dominant in their era. Rather, they combine multiple approaches or use that, the patterns they see in what kinds of leaders appeal to Americans in their moment as a way of diagnosing the deeper anxieties. And I think Obama had the ability to speak as a prophet, to engage in that kind of African American preacher tradition, and that was often very effective. But he was more frequently in the mode of the expert, the voice of cool reason. And maybe a kind of romantic nostalgia for the time of Obama and what many Americans thought that meant for where we were as a country has encouraged Democrats to hang on to, I suppose, a rosier view of the effectiveness of that mode of interacting and storytelling than than it may deserve, given what we're seeing in the broader political landscape.
One of the things points you make in the book, I think, is so interesting. You mention Washington, and you say like, look, in this revolutionary age, he's almost the antitype, right? Because he's so ordered and so he's a structured sort of guy. He's a figure that seems out of step. But you say no. It sometimes the charismatic leadership, sometimes the charisma is in reaction to it's controlled by what's going on, right? So you might not embody it. You might not embody it. You might be its corrective, right? But in some sense, there's a charismatic zeitgeist, right? And you're going to be in relationship to it, right? You're going to be either embodying it, like Washington. You're going to be its foil in the way you need. But somehow, if you're out of step with the zeitgeist, right? And it seems like with what we were just talking about with regard to the Democrats in the last election, just out of step with the zeitgeist, right? Just out of step, right? The cool technocrat that can wax folksy and charismatic and black ecclesial sort of all this. No, it's just not the thing, right? And Trump has the thing. Trump has the thing. He is the zeitgeist in some sense, right? And it just if you're at a step with the zeitgeist, is one of the things I got from your book. You're not going to be the charismatic driver. That you've got. It's almost like surfing or something, right? You've got to figure your relationship to the wave.
That's absolutely right. Although I think it raises an interesting question, which is what should be our definition of success on the part of a leader. And one obvious pattern in most of the charismatic leaders I write about is that often in the short term they don't have success. Their movements fizzle out. They end up banished or deported, assassinated, what have you. And so there's a short term way of evaluating them that would be pretty punishing, I think, in the kind of scorecard of achievement of power. And certainly charisma, because it's a mode of authority that is distinct from authority you get through an institutional position or that is bestowed upon you by tradition or comes because you have a monopoly on force. In many ways it's the last resort of the weak. It's the kind of authority you strive for if you don't have access to those other kind of more reliable modes of bossing around your fellow humans. So maybe in that sense it's little wonder that many of these movements don't have immediate success in their goals. But I think it's important to take a longer range view. So I think about the Puritan heretic Anne Hutchinson, who's the character I start the book with, and she has, in the mid 1630s, this brief moment of incredible power. I mean, at the height of her influence, she has turned about half the congregation in Boston to her side against the claims of the most of the ministers and reigning magistrates, and really convinced her followers to question the whole paradigm of kind of constant self-lashing scrutiny that is such a feature of Puritan practice and sociology. To going to your diary every night and scrupulously scanning the events of the day to look for evidence that you are among the God's elect. And while you believe in predestination, you are supposed to constantly prepare yourself for the gift of His grace and look for evidence that you are living a sanctified life as a member of the elect would. And Anne Hutchinson comes along and says, actually, through rigorous engagement with Scripture and attunement to the Holy Spirit, you will receive that divine assurance directly. And hey, I'm not even sure our ministers have gotten that assurance. I'm not sure they're preaching under what she called the seal of the Spirit. Now, it didn't take that long for her enemies to mobilize the mechanisms of discipline and put her on trial, both for her slandering of ministers and her violation of civic authority. And she ends up banished and, in short order, murdered in an Indian attack after her family moves to New York, the colony of New York. So you could say in
In
the
the
short
age of
term, what it
in the age of Epstein, that would have been a conspiracy, right?
right?
We're gonna release the
Well,
Indian files, okay? The Puritan, the ministers hired the Indians, okay? They were white Indians, okay? They were for, it would have been, there's no way that would have.
that is an amusing counterfactual, yes. But like, I think it's easy to see her story as one of failure. And in the years immediately following her banishment, the Puritan town fathers spent like a tremendous amount of time and energy passing all kinds of laws to try to make sure that no one ever became another Anne Hutchinson, and requiring or at least strongly encouraging local ministers to meet to kind of share notes. How's your situation, over in Springfield, and do you have any like would-be heretics that you need to get out ahead of, and beefing up the punishment for people who speak out of turn against the church authorities. And they look at what's happening in the kind of brewing civil war in England, where they all come from, and they think, we are preserving the city on the hill. They've got so much anarchy over there that'll never happen here. But in the long term, Anne Hutchinson really has the last laugh. I mean, her message that the core thing is this personal relationship with the divine. I mean, in many ways, that becomes the marrow of American spirituality, far more than any vision that the Puritan town fathers have of a theocracy. Now, Anne Hutchinson was no like multicultural progressive, and she would be equally horrified by where that goes, that kind of individual connection with the divine, that idea that we're entitled to that. Goes off the rails as far as she's concerned. But my point is that there's a way in which charismatic leaders might crash and burn in the short term, but have major influence in the long term story of American culture.
You say something interesting in the Benjamin Lay section. I love this. This writing is so beautiful. You talk about holy fools, and you say holy fools have thrived in mystical traditions where the boundaries between human and divine are more porous, but where most people cleaning house, tilling fields, loving and hating and gossiping have tended to forget that their world is honeycombed with corridors for divine power. I mean, that is. I thought of this passage when you talk about Hutchinson and her wondering about where, if the preachers had access to the honeycombs, if they were forsaking it. But that's amazing to me that one of the things the Holy Fool does, one of the things that some of these charismatic leaders can do, is they can show you that just at the edge of your reality is transcendence, and you may be blinded to it, right? Because you're just doing one damn thing after that. Like most of us, life is just is overwhelming and complex and drudgery and anxiety provoking. But you that's so fantastic, right? That those words, right? That do you see that in your life? Do you are you seeing honeycombs, these quarters of divine power? I mean, is that you've been a Christian since 2022, right? That's your baptism, 2022. Full immersion, right?
That's right.
Full
Properly.
immersion. That's so fantastic. What's the temperature of the water, by the way?
Oh, it's a seeker sensitive megachurch, so they make sure it's
Ah,
bath water.
yeah. All right. That's it just strikes me as it should be cold, ice cold or something. But
I agree. I was kind of glad it wasn't cold, but I thought it ought to
just
be.
something shocking. No, but that's it. Are you? Do you have that experience where, like, oh my gosh, these interruptions of the divine in your life?
This is another way in which I am really trying to retrain my mind. I remember after reading David Bentley Hart's book, The Experience of God, Being, Consciousness, and Bliss, which I would recommend to anyone. It's a really effective rejoinder to atheists who think that they have all kinds of arguments that demolish the case for theism, when really they are arguing against a conception of God that is totally unlike the deity that at least the major Abrahamic religions believe in. But he's Eastern Orthodox, and so it's in some ways very cerebral, systematic theology, but is shot through with this call to a posture of awe and openness, kind of more a Christian version of Emerson's metaphor, of the transcendent, of the transparent eyeball, right? Ralph Waldo Emerson, the father of transcendentalism, wanted us to move through the world in a state of just 360-degree openness to the presence of the divine. And he deviated in major ways from his own Christian background. But I think there's a Christian version of that that calls us to look up at the glittering of the sun through the leaves when we're walking home from the bus stop, and marvel at those everyday sights as shot through with God's presence. But it's a spiritual discipline. Certainly, I pray for a little more shock and awe on God's part on a regular basis.
Do you say that to God? Do you say a little more shock and awe, please? Or just shock or awe? I'll take one or two. I mean, that's not in the Anglican prayer book. There's no shock and awe prayer. There's no Desert Storm prayer. What does that prayer look like specifically?
I'm a Baptist, right? We freestyle it. We do whatever we want. I suppose I haven't used quite that phrase. Maybe that's the key. But I remember, I was sort of on this path to reasoning my way to Christianity. It seemed to me, surely I couldn't get all the way there just by means of reading enough footnotes. Like at a certain point, surely there had to be an affective shift. I had to feel something. And I will say I was reading the Gospels in a new way, and they were, and still do, coming alive for me in a way that was absolutely different from how I'd encountered Scripture before. But yeah, I was greedy. I wanted at least like a serious dose of warm and fuzzy, if I couldn't have a full on mystical vision or something. And I took this to my now pastor, and he said, "Listen, I'm a pastor, and I've never had anything like that. I mean, this is where it's kind of nice to be in a hanging out with Reformed Baptists, because they modulate your expectations, unlike maybe the Pentecostals would." But he said, "You have to."
I'm surprised no one's ever written a folk song titled that. Modulate your spiritual expectations. Like, that's a great worship song. All right. Let's key up the karaoke machine, the smoke. Let's get the we're gonna sing. Raise your hands high, close your eyes. We're gonna sing, "Oh God, help me modulate my spiritual expectations."
And I admit I have many gifts, but maybe catchy, to the point, CCM lyrics are not among them. But he also cautioned me against making an idol of the experience, and to remember that the point is to seek God, not to seek some kind of experience that you think is God. It also has helped me a great deal to rediscover the Puritans. I've always loved the Puritans, teach them, write about them, but after becoming a Christian, I really read them in a different way, and as spiritual directors for me. And these are not hand waving holy rollers, right? By any means. Not that they didn't have their forays into mysticism. I mean, Puritanism is it's a variety of pietism, right? So I don't want to be guilty of that caricature that we encounter too frequently of Puritans as totally staid and somber individuals who never felt the movement of the Spirit, because that's not true. However, they did write at great length about the feeling of God's absence. And I'm thinking especially of the English Puritan John Owen, and his writing on the desire for God's presence, and how that desire itself, that's not you, the human, ginning up some feeling, some hunger from your mortal self. That desire would not be there if God had not put that there in you. And so the desire is itself a relationship with God. it gave me a way of recasting the feeling of God's absence as a kind of presence, even if it's not the kind I imagined. So that's kind of where I am in my halting steps along this path. But do I hope to see or experience a miraculous healing and or have an incontrovertible vision? Absolutely. Although I'll be sure if it ever happens to immediately write it down in detail and record myself describing it, because one thing I've noticed about myself and about humans generally is that we are so quick to rationalize away the miraculous and second guess and come up with other explanations. And so I have in my head like this fantasy about, well, surely there's some kind of miraculous thing that could happen that would totally shut down all my doubts.
Yeah.
But I know that's actually not true. I
No,
would manage to talk myself out of it
it
somehow.
didn't happen in the Gospels, right? I mean, people saw a lot of interesting
Absolutely.
things. People saw a lot of interesting things, and did not have faith that was unshakable. It's interesting. I was listening to this song recently. Uh, it's a William Cowper song, but it was redone by a guy Derek Webb. But Cowper was, I guess, he was like what 18th, 17th century, 18th century hymn writer. And it's called "Sometimes a Light Surprises." And the opening thing is, it's sometimes a light surprises the Christian while he sings. It is the Lord who rises with healing in his wings. When comforts are declining, he grants the soul again a season of clear shining to cheer it after the rain. And so I was talking with a friend of mine. One of my close friends is an Orthodox rabbi, and I was talking with him about this song. I was like, it's so interesting because you're davening or whatever, and you're whatever, and you're and the experience. What Cowper is assuming is it doesn't happen all the time. That you'll have these long seasons of singing, or my Orthodox friend, I'm like, you're davening all the time at the shul or whatever. And the assumption here that I think is a biblical one is you're just going to do this stuff, and it's not, and the norm will be this is not happening. So somehow this is a grace that once in a while you get that sustains you in the rhythms of going about the practices which are promised to be life giving. For some reason, that was I don't know, that struck me as helpful. Um, these old
It's right in line with the Psalms, right? I mean, the
right.
Psalms are shot through with cries out to God and in the feeling of his absence.
Never underestimate the value of the Calvinist hymn writer in your life. You know what I mean? Like, let's three cheers for the Calvinist white guy hymn writers. Uh,
Amen.
yeah, so you say something about I found this is another gem I found in the book. You're talking about Jemima Wilkinson, who I had no idea about, and it's this great section of the book. I think she was in the revolutionary section, and she was going by the name Public Universal Friend, and was this interesting part of a cadre. I mean, not unheard of, not a majority, but not unheard of. These female prophetic preachers, and you talk about uh, this apocalyptic kind of dimensions to some of her and people like her, and you say that there's this Marxist tendency just to dismiss this. It's just sort of like, I mean, look, I don't think when Marx says the opium of the people, it's all negative, but this idea though that like that if you weren't on the wrong end of the class conflict, you wouldn't need this consolation, and it's just sort of. But you say this is great. You say dismissing this. You say, but the wide range of professions and social backgrounds reflected in most of these movements, including followers of the public universal friend, challenges this analysis. People feel alienated from the status quo and terrorized by the universe for all kinds of reasons. That's a great point. Terrorized, right? Even if you're white, middle class, affluent, you're teaching at UNC or whatever, you're moving money, you're a stock, whatever you're doing, right? You can be on the privileged side of life. You can have most of life has gone your way relative to the world population as far as economics and social things and other things, and yet the universe can feel like a terror. And you get somebody with some charisma, right, that can pull back the veil and give you a story and that's incredibly therapeutic. And when people, it's sort of like when people just trivialize religion. Oh, what do you need? Some mythological story to get along with the world? Yes, right. Yes, we all need these stories, right? Because the universe can be awful.
Right, and our needs go far beyond, basic material comforts. And there's been a lot of interesting sociological research on the significant levels of misery, right, that exist in the higher echelons of our socioeconomic pyramid. And I think there is this cliche way of dismissing, especially the more what the mainstream kind of secular establishment would view as odd, bizarre, highly supernatural, sectarian religious movements, as only appealing to the dispossessed, to people who are miserable. But it's just not borne out by any of the data that we have, and in our own time. I mean, this is something that the political scientist Ryan Burge has done a lot of interesting work
Yeah,
on. There's an even more pronounced correlation between educational attainment, higher levels of education, and religiosity. So the more educated you are, the more likely you are to go to church, which is, I think, a very startling revelation for many secular people. Certainly, the public universal friend, call that, drawing that name from the Quaker tradition of referring to evangelists as public friends, in that way that the Quakers used the term friend. She almost dies as a young woman, and comes to having had this spiritual experience in which, indeed, the human known as Jemima Wilkinson did die, and now her body has been inhabited by this kind of androgynous divine presence. It's a little bit unclear, what this meant, but the presence of the Holy Spirit in some important kind of messianic way. And she dresses in a very androgynous fashion, and prefers to be seen as having transcended gender, and is calling followers out of this world to help build a kind of new Jerusalem. And her followers, I mean, certainly they include people who have had a rough go of it. This is in the thick of the Revolutionary War, and have lost family and have been uprooted. Certainly makes sense. But then you also have a member of the Rhode Island Supreme Court who's keen to offer her accommodation in his house, and really become an important part of her movement. So you have people who seem like they have everything to lose by abandoning the establishment, but they weren't getting that compelling story that made sense of their world and gave them a sense of meaning, and they find it in the public universal friend.
you say something towards the end of the book. You're talking about uh, lessons about charisma, and this is great. You say, if the history of charismatic leaders teaches anything, it's that observers who are trying to understand a leader's relationship with his followers makes a mistake if they focus on the cogency of his arguments, the soundness of his factual claims, or the attractiveness of his personality. In the contemporary world, access to mass media may be necessary to build a movement, but it is far from sufficient. And I circled this and highlighted it and wrote it. I was like, why the Democrats lost and lose? I put in the margins because this is what he said was. I mean, look at what and this is his facts, and this argument is so dumb. And I mean, and Epstein and I find myself falling into this, right. I'm like that. I was like, he was just Rudolph Boltmann. He just demythologized. He told them the Epstein. It's like the great demythologizer Boltmann. The resurrection. That's just the husk. The real thing is existential, and he just demythologizes. The Epstein. That's not true. The real Colonel is MAGA. It's not. It's the, but this is the problem with people. I think that are intellectuals or self-styled intellectuals and critics and things like this. They miss this, right? They miss exactly what you're saying. That there's, the Holy. You begin the book with this sense of the Holy Spirit drops and things happen, and there's an electricity that if you're not in it, you're not understanding it, right? I mean, and there's a field around somebody like Donald Trump, and if you're not in it, you don't get it. And I feel like that's one of the great takeaways of your book, right? That you're not, this is not how you get what's going on, right? By fact checking it on PBS, or getting Anderson Cooper to do a quick screen grab of all the falsehoods, right?
Absolutely. But I suppose when you're in the movement, you're not necessarily getting it either. If by getting it, we are imagining some, hyper rational view from nowhere that understands why a particular figure is gaining authority for a large swath of the country. So part of my hope for the book is that by beginning to see these patterns in history in such disparate contexts, in a way that really drives home the kind of universality of certain human cravings, we can begin to be a little more self aware and interrogate our own relationships to authority figures and discern the difference between a healthy relationship and one that is maybe untethering us from the checks and balances that we all need to get at least a little bit closer to that asymptote of objective reality, that maybe we can't perfectly reach, but we cannot give up trying, or we've lost everything. So I think that, both, from all perspectives, from within a movement and outside a movement, there's a real help in beginning to see oneself in light of these broader patterns.
You say that in the end, you're talking about these paradoxes of charisma, and one of them is, you say, this is great. Humans want control and security at the same time. That they want to feel like independent. They want to feel like they have agency over their story, and yet they want to feel safe, which often involves giving up, trusting authority, right? Trusting, like, somehow feeling led, right? And that there's just no getting away from this, right? It doesn't matter how much Enlightenment philosophy you've read, how feminist autonomous you feel, how much that, what sort of, you can pick all the pronouns you want, whatever, right? This twin dynamic of wanting control and needing to cede control, it just comes with human DNA, right?
I do think so. That we want some sense of being more than a leaf carried along on the winds of time, but actual responsibility for fundamental things in our lives is a scary prospect. So we're constantly shrinking back from that, and we need a story and a leader, set of institutions and communities that help us manage, that very delicate equilibrium.
You also say that this there's this persistent desire to have a meaningful story, which can allow you to ignore persistent facts, right? And I think this is something that admirably you've narrated in this conversation, and other places I've heard you talk about this, that like you didn't go from no story to the Christian story. Whereas I feel like people that are secularists, right, or they consider themselves just non-religious, don't think they live in a story, right? They don't think that the Constitution's a story, the Declaration of Independence is a story, Enlightenment autonomy is a story, gender egalitarianism is a story. These are all stories, right? That look. I mean, you want to talk about egalitarianism? What story seems more in the face of persistent facts? And nobody seems equal, right? If if equality was the aim of the creator, this is a piss poor attempt at it, right? Because no one's equal, and yet we do. It's something we cling to, the story that we're all equal and we all have inalienable rights, and this sort of stuff. That this capacity, right, to need these meaningful stories is just what it means to be human. I mean, when you realize, as you continue to realize, like when you first realized how storied your life was as a secular kind of person, how was that? I mean, did that help in your conversion? Did that help open you up to sort of changing stories, converting stories? Was that did that come after you converted? I mean, when did you become more present to the sort of inherited nature of the story you had before your conversion?
I think I was open to the gospel in a new way because over the preceding few years I had become less confident in the story I thought I was living in the context of the secular university. And I see in retrospect that I treated the university as my church in important ways and expected from my role there a sense of fulfilling a mission connected to some matter of ultimate concern, the pursuit of knowledge, the old school values of the Enlightenment, and seeing the spectrum of questions that people in secular academia are encouraged to pursue, and the range of debate on an increasing number of controversial issues, just made me confront certain patterns of illiberalism in the university, which I still love dearly, and I think it's still a wonderful place to be trying to figure out the world. But I had to kind of come to terms with its flaws and limitations that compelled me to rethink a lot of what I thought was working for me in my old worldview. So certainly that instability in my secular story about the world was a crucial preliminary state. And I think this is important in the context of evangelism, and something that Tim Keller really stressed in the latter part of his career. He published Reason for God, his fantastic, but in some ways fairly traditional work of apologetics in 2008. And then he said openly that he realized, even though that book sold zillions of copies and continues to, that in some ways it didn't speak to the kind of prior set of problems and objections that 21st century people have, who need to be persuaded of the problems and blind spots and incoherence of their own non-Christian worldview before they can even be open to what you might have to say about the existence of the Christian God or the resurrection. So he wrote, Making Sense of God, and did a series of podcasts really focused on that. Because I think he saw exactly the point you're making, that you have to destabilize that pagan story before you can make the case for the Christian one.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's.
And I should say, Scott, that I've got to make dinner pretty soon. So
We should.
I
We
may
should.
need.
This is part of. This is where this could be the next honeycomb of the divine corridor, when you're just making dinner, and it's the ordinary, like Luther says, you do it unto the Lord, right? Yeah.
That's
So,
right.
as we close, have you evangelized anybody? You're Southern Baptist, by the way. Your parents must love that. Your secular parents. Oh my gosh, what's your daughter? Well, she's very accomplished, even though she's a Southern Baptist. I mean, that's of all the kind of Christian things you could become. To the culture, to a certain part of the culture, that moniker is just it's edgy, right?
Yeah, and I lean into my Southern Baptist affiliation when I want to get a rise out of my secular liberal friends and family, but I don't actually have any particular investment in being a Southern Baptist. It's rather that this is the place where it is uh, most fruitful for me to be trying to learn to love the Bible and love Jesus. It was
That's
liberating though.
beautiful that you can say that.
I mean, I was intimidated. My church is not. It's not just Southern Baptist. It's the most evangelistic congregation in the whole convention. I mean, it sent the most missionaries
What's the name of the
out
church?
from the
What's it called?
church. It's called the Summit Church in Raleigh, and it sent the most missionaries out, of the whole convention for more than a decade, and just it's an incredible evangelistic machine, and it's kind of intimidating to be a part of that culture. But then I realized fairly early, after my conversion, that simply telling people what happened to me counts as evangelism. And that was a new way of thinking about it. And it liberated me from this sense that it would be some kind of alien mode, because it's a crazy thing that happened to me, and I'm still trying to make sense of it and
Yeah,
processing it, and I talk about it a lot. So that I can do, and if that counts as evangelism, then great. I guess I'm an evangelist.
that's amazing. Leslie Newbegin says somewhere that the gospel is the answer to the question people have when they see the kingdom, they see things happen, and they're like, "What the hell is that?" And you say, "Well, this is it. It's your story, right? It's the story of what of the healing of the change, and it's amazing that you're part of that. Like your story has become part of an unfolding story that is one of divine intervention and healing and grace. That's amazing. I'm glad. I'm glad it's your story. I'm glad you wrote this great story about charisma, Spellbound, and I'm glad you could come back on the podcast and talk about it. And I'd love to have you back on again.
Thanks so much. This has been fun.